Okay, so now we're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about the Vikings. So let's go take a look at the famous Vikings because they are an important part of the Middle Ages time period. We know known as is the Norse. Oh, I gotta pop up. The Norse, also known as the Nordic men or the Northmen, all these different sort of names for them. So who were they actually? Basically, they were a group from the far north of Europe, basically the area that we would call Scandinavia today, places like Sweden and Finland. And they had a lot of culture in common with the Germanic peoples that we've been talking about. And so they were kind of the last sort of unchristianized people before they finally adopted Christianity later on. And the Norse, at a certain point in the Middle Ages, they started traveling a lot. They built ships. They were very good shipbuilders, and they started sailing all over the dang place. They started sailing all the way down to all the way into the Mediterranean and selling to Britain and also all the way to Russia. They were traveling a lot of different places, and so they were actually an influence in a lot of different places as well. A lot of parts of the world still have an influence from their culture today. And the interesting thing about them being the last of the Europeans to become Christians is that we know a lot of their stories. We know Norse mythology pretty well because by the time that it got to them, it was much more common to write things down of the old mythology. So we know the Norse mythology a lot better, say, than we know the German mythology or the Celtic mythology. We have a better picture of it because they wrote it down in a lot of sagas. But yeah, they were the men of the North, or the people of the North, I should really say. It wasn't just men. But why do we call them Vikings? Well, Vikings is basically just a word that means kind of raiders, pirates. And if you think about what is your image of a Viking, how does a Viking appear to your mind? Why would someone name a sports team after the Vikings? It's because they seem very ferocious and bloodthirsty. What do you picture, right? A bunch of very bearded men looking, very tough and in armor and terrifying and slashing and killing and plundering and wearing horned helmets, right? That's not actually really accurate to who they were, but it's how the people who encountered them remembered them. So the first time Vikings appear in sort of our history texts, our historical texts, is when a bunch of monasteries report being raided by these weird, terrifying people from outside. The first appearance is in 793 in Britain. So these British monasteries, which are pretty influential to our culture today, report a bunch of terrifying people come in and take all their gold and jewels and valuables and run off with it. And they're generally just very terrifying and ferocious. That's the picture of the Vikings that we have. But it seems like the Vikings were not actually necessarily all about wild warfare and things like that. That's just how the outsiders perceived them. They had a pretty interesting culture. For instance, one thing is that they had a very strong respect for women. There were women warriors. Women were very highly honored. Women had a lot of power in that society to own land and to make decisions back in Scandinavia. Seems to have been very heavily respected and not this sort of negativity that other cultures had towards women. And interestingly, the Vikings traded with the Muslims, which is something you don't hear about very often. Vikings and the caliphates were very much in close contact with each other. And so you find Viking stuff in the East, in the Near East, and you find Muslim art all the way over in Scandinavia. They were in pretty close contact. So part of all that sailing around was trading and buying and selling things too. And of course, they were excellent seafarers and explorers. It's now known, for instance, that it wasn't Christopher Columbus who was the first European to get to America. It was Leif Erikson, a Viking, who named the region Vinland and set up some towns, but didn't ultimately last, didn't stay. And so they were explorers, and there's even a theory that they were regularly visiting North America to catch the fish that were there, which is a pretty interesting concept. But yeah, very terrifying to outsiders, but maybe a nice culture to be a part of if you were among them. And the whole thing about them having, us knowing Norse mythology and German mythology are very, very similar, actually. But we're more familiar with Norse mythology because of them being the last to convert to Christianity, and so one of the ones who wrote their stories down in a lot of detail. But it seems like they had roughly the same set of gods as the German peoples, the Gauls and the Goths and whatnot, that the Romans were encountering. So, for instance, in Norse mythology, we have the famous figure of Odin, the one-eyed father god who watches over the people and is always sort of journeying and carrying a staff, kind of looks like a wizard. In Germanic mythology, he's known as Woden instead of Odin. And from Woden is actually where we get the word Wednesday, Woden's Day. A lot of Germanic gods lent themselves to the names of the week in English. And England, Britain are actually pretty influenced by Germanic culture, Norse culture, and Roman culture all at the same time. But yeah, so the horned helmets thing, very false. Not true. There were not actually horned helmets. No Viking historically wore a horned helmet. This is more what a Viking helmet would look like. So we got to ask, why do people think that Vikings have horned helmets? Well, first off, let's talk about why they didn't have horned helmets. Think about you're going into battle, and you got horns on your helmet. What's going to happen to you? Well, some guy is going to come along and he's going to yank you down by the helmet. He's going to grab onto the horns and he's going to throw you down to the ground, and then he's just going to start wailing on you. So they're actually a terrible idea, even though they might have some intimidation value. But the reason why we think that they do is there's this guy named Wagner, and he wanted to sort of reinterpret the myths of Germanic culture, especially. It was a whole sort of nationalism, a little bit racism type of thing for him to talk about Germanic culture and how it was the best. And so he wanted to tell the story of the Ring, which is a famous sort of German myth. He wrote these operas. And the casting, the art style for that, the costuming basically, involved these horn helmets. That was the idea that was done in his operas, in the Ring Cycle operas. And then Bugs Bunny took that and made references to it in a famous cartoon about opera. And so if you didn't get it from going and seeing these operas, you might get the horned helmets thing from Bugs Bunny. And so that's our pop cultural image now. But yeah, not actually any horned helmets. Look at this map. These are sort of the areas that they come from. And so while they were raiding, they were also building their own towns as well. So anything red and orange here on this map is a place where they were sort of building their own settlements. And so you can see that they were an influence on Russia as well, somewhat on England and France in certain regions, even an influence in Italy later on. But the green ones are where they were raiding, but they weren't settling. And of course, the Scandinavians settled Iceland and Greenland. Pretty big deal. Still very influenced by them today. Yeah. But let's talk about this weird little thing here. The Norse settling in a region known as Normandy. Well, the funny thing is they settle down and they eventually become known as the Normans. But I'll say more on that in just a second here. Okay, so continuing on our theme of comparing sort of pop culture to all this history, you might be wondering, how does Skyrim, which is based on Norse culture, how does this game compare to the historical Vikings? Yes, there was a lot of emphasis on warriors, but it's a little overemphasized in popular culture. But it is true that there were a lot of Norse warriors. Yes, they were sort of pale, blonde people from the far north. Yes, they did have women warriors, which is pretty cool. Maybe even more than there were in Skyrim. In Skyrim, they have these halls where the sort of powerful kings and nobles would have everybody gather around a fire. And these nobles were known as jarls, which is actually related to the word earl. So these jarls were sort of the local leaders, and they would have their warriors who were loyal to them, kind of like the knights and kings thing, basically the same thing, or approximately. And everyone would meet around this big sort of fireplace up in the north. Yeah, that's true too, and that's something you see in Skyrim as well. In Skyrim, you have horned helmets, so take the horns off the helmets there. Other than the horns, the helmets are pretty accurate. In Skyrim, they have this whole thing about racism, that the Norse are really racist, and the Nords are really racist, and that wasn't true of the historical Norse. And that might be just the influence of Wagner and people like him who sort of misinterpret the Vikings. That might be because of them. Because the Norse were really multicultural and had a strong respect for other cultures like the Muslims, and were really positive about that. You see a lot of these big burial mounds in Skyrim. That's something that the Vikings had. You see these sort of weird zombies, which are called the Draugr, also known as revenants, and these zombie warriors that try and attack you when you come into the tomb. Now, as far as we know, that isn't historically something the Vikings had, but that's definitely a sort of myth that they told, that the dead kings who slept in the burial mounds would rise from the dead to protect them and keep grave robbers from stealing their stuff. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, and of course Skyrim has dragons. You see them in both dragons in both German mythology and Norse mythology. So yeah, that's pretty accurate too. Here's one of those burial mounds, a pretty early one. This is more kind of what it would have looked like. Okay, so I talked about the Normans. Basically, a bunch of Norse, they settle in this region of France. And then the funny thing is, then they go and invade Britain. And so weirdly, even though we kind of think of the Vikings as an outside culture, as a no longer around culture, in a roundabout way, they were actually pretty influential on the culture of Britain. The Normans ruled the whole region for a while, and Normans is just what you call Norsemen when they've settled down for a while. And so the English culture, the culture that kind of creates England and then goes on to really influence America, has to do with these these Normans who speak French, French or Latin. It's kind of in between at this point. And they're ruling a bunch of sort of native Germans and Celts and things like that. And so English culture is this fusion of all of these different influences. And one way that you can kind of notice this is that, you ever notice how there's kind of different sets of vocabulary in English? There's like fancy vocabulary, and then there's like simple vocabulary, different ways of saying the same thing. Like you can have air, or you can have ether. You can have a smell, or you can have an odor. You know, all these sort of different things. You can think, or you can perceive. All of that. Well, apparently, the French and Latin words are the ones in English that sort of connote this fanciness and this sort of elegant vocabulary. And the German words are the ones that sort of connote this roughness and this down-to-earth quality. And this is because the Normans, they all spoke this sort of Frenchy Latin, while the people who were the peasants spoke the dirty Anglo-Saxon German. Yeah, and so you can still tell these different things today. You can compare all these different vocabulary words. You can ask or you can inquire. You can you can be brotherly or you can be fraternal. All sorts of things like that. So it's fascinating to think that all this time later, this conquest happened in the 1000s. All this time later, we're still pretty strongly influenced by these Normans conquering England. So yeah, something to think about right there. Another interesting thing is they the words for animals all tend to be the German words, where the words for the meat that you get from those animals tend to be this Frenchy Latin type stuff. Okay, I think that's all we have time for in this video. So that's about it for the Vikings, the Norse. But we'll pick back up and we'll finish out the rest of the medieval stuff.